The Vietnam War had been publicized to the wider community as a democratic war to liberate the South Vietnamese people from the communist aggression of the North. The war had been sold to the public as something that America, a first world, wealthy, and sophisticated country, would have no problem defeating. It was not understood well by the broader public. This stance started being questioned by the public when there was a retaliation bombing attack in North Vietnam in 1965, at the same time as the number of deaths of Americans in Vietnam began to rise. At this time, the war became a military, political, and social issue across the United States, with the support against it continuing to expand through to 1971. Whilst it is almost impossible to determine who in particular started the opposition to the war, there has always been a small, core peace movement in the US. This movement was based on both Quaker and Unitarian beliefs, one of peaceful Christian principles and the other of liberal religious denomination. This movement did not gain public traction or widespread support until the tensions surrounding the Cold War era. When you are looking at the numbers involved with the Vietnam War, it is obvious why there had to be a protest to it. The toll for those who were directly involved was huge. 58,000 total US troops were killed, 1.3 total military deaths for all countries involved, and 1 million total civilian deaths. A growth in the use and testing of nuclear weapons throughout the late 1950s led Norman Cousins, editor of the Saturday Review, and Clarence Pickett, American theologian and member of Quaker, to fund the National Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, or SANE, in 1957. We have seen this growing awareness portrayed in Dr. Strangelove by Stanley Kubrick and in the Australian novel On the Beach by Neville Shute, as well as the same stance reflected in other groups like the Alderson Marchers in the United Kingdom. The Student Peace Union, or the SPU, also emerged in 1959 across college campuses and took on a more liberal rather than radical view, similar to that of SANE. Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, had replaced these groups by 1964. The goals of the SDS went beyond those of SANEs and SPUs. They were goals which encompassed the restructuring of American society. Whilst there may not have been many people who personally felt the need to fight for the reduction of nuclear weapons, many more members of society were able to relate to the ideas of wanting the American society to change, to fix those things that were not working. Once more people were able to relate, there began to be more open support. This idea of change in society brought hope to those it was failing. Influence on the anti-nuclear movement had come from the UK, and it really related to the great threat of the reality of atomic warfare. The agreement reached in 1968 to stop the growth of nuclear weapons gave the 60s its greatest hope for future generations. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was an agreement signed in 1968 by several of the major nuclear and non-nuclear powers that pledged their cooperation in stemming the spread of nuclear technology. Although the NPT did not ultimately prevent the nuclear proliferation, in the context of the Cold War arms race and the mounting international concern about the consequences of nuclear war, the treaty was a major success for advocates of arms control because it set a precedent for international cooperation between the nuclear and non-nuclear states to prevent proliferation. At the same time as the peace movement was peaking in the 1960s, there was a societal change associated with the struggles of the African American civil rights movement. There were various public protests that turned violent through the 60s and 70s, places like Berkeley, etc. As we can see today, they continue with Ferguson. The push for civil rights was a huge part in changing society's values at the time. The fact that African Americans were pushing for freedom and racial equality at the time that a group of white, middle-class students were challenging social norms meant that there was solidarity in the movements. Martin Luther King was another example of an assassination in the 60s during a volatile period in American history. His August 28, 1963, I Have a Dream speech is probably the most quoted modern history speech today. These rallies and protests brought hope through their huge public participation rates, and the photographic images changed societal ideas. His 1967 speech regarding the Vietnam War is incredibly relevant to the cause of the peace movement, especially as he'd been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. Beyond Vietnam, address delivered to the clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam at Riverside Church the 4th of April 1967. I join you in this meeting because I am in the deepest agreement with the aims and work of the organisation which has brought us together, clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam. The recent statements of your executive committee are the sentiments of my own heart, and I found myself in full accord when I read its opening lines. A time comes when silence is betrayal. That time has come for us in relation to Vietnam. This slide shows the points that he made at the end of this speech. The climax to it is astonishing. In relation to the music and the popular culture of the time, in particular the Beatles, they seemed to transform from the initial clean-cut boys from Liverpool to the eventual hippies in bed with long hair. This was reflected through most of the music scene, with the beginning containing pop music and themes of the 1950s, with some rebellious thoughts being sung by the likes of Bob Dylan. These rebellious thoughts would generate change in the community, and by the end of the decade, the music festival Woodstock would be a rallying point for peace, where hope could be seen by the followers of the movement in the many people coming together in solidarity. Throughout the decade, and for some years before and after, we had seen immense change and cross-fertilization of the arts, as they acted in unison against, in particular, nuclear weapons and the Vietnam War. This culminates at the end of the decade with Woodstock, and during the large period leading to this festival, we see veterans throwing away their medals and great civil unrest. All of this, protests, art influence, authors, the music scene, the draft, the political lies that were to be further extended and lead to the 70s impeachment of the American President Richard Nixon, had provided a perfect storm for peace. In turn, the hope of a generation who had rebelled against society's norms was delivered upon with the eventual American withdrawal from Vietnam on March 29, 1973, amidst chaotic scenes. This movement, whilst only lasting at its peak for the decade, provided an opportunity for the youth of America to fuel themselves with hope for their futures and their children's futures. Thank you for your time. That concludes my lecture for today, and I will finish with a song.